Hello, welcome back to this course. In this lecture, we're going to look at PHP variable scope. So we're going to understand different types of variable scope in PHP. We will learn how local, global, and static variables behave. And we'll also explore examples of each type of variable scope. In PHP, the scope of the variable determines where in the script the variable can be accessed. PHP supports the following types of variable scopes: local scope, global scope, and static scope. We will start by looking at the local variables. So a local variable, this is a variable declared inside a function. This means it can only be accessed within that function and cannot be used outside of it. Some of the key points to note is that local variables are created when the function is called and destroyed when the function execution ends. They do not interfere with variables of the same name outside the function. Now let's have a look at an example of how we declare local variables. So we have this function that has a variable message declared inside it, and we echo the message in this particular function. So the variable message in this function display message cannot be accessed outside the function display message. So if we try accessing this message variable, it means that we are going to get an error. So let's try accessing it at this point. So we're going to echo the message here. Remember, this is a local variable. So let's save this. Then let's run our PHP script. So we are getting undefined variable message because this message cannot be accessed outside the function. But if we come down here below and we execute the function display message, then we can comment this out. If we run our application right now, we'll be able to get the message hello world. So let's run our script. So now, as you can see, we are able to get the message hello world. So this is from the variable message that can only be accessed within the function. So that's how local variable works. Now let's have a look at the second type of variable scope, that is global scope. In PHP, variable declared outside of a function are considered global variables. By default, global variables are not accessible within functions or methods. The global keyword is used to explicitly grant access to these variables inside functions. To access global variables inside a function, you can use the keyword global. When you declare a variable as global inside a function, PHP binds it to the global variable with the same name. So now let's look at an example of a global variable. So in this case, we have a variable that is defined outside of a function. So this is a global variable. If we are to access this inside a function, we'll need to include the global keyword before the variable. So this is where we are declaring the global variable. Then at this point, we are incrementing whatever the value we have in the global variable by 1. So counter plus plus, it's the same as saying counter equal to counter plus 1. So we'll have the output right here after the increment. So we expect this to be equal to 11 as the initial value of the global variable counter is 10. So let's save this and run. So if we run this, we should be getting 11. So in case we try to comment this out, it means that we will be getting an error since we'll be trying to access a variable that is not defined, that is on counter plus plus. So let's run this and see. So we're getting an error right here, undefined variable counter, because this is a global variable and we didn't define it as a global variable. Let's have a look at another example whereby we will be defining multiple global variables. So let's say we have a global variable x equal to 5 and y equal to 10. So these are global variables. So I'm going to have a function that adds the two variables. So this is a function that we are declaring multiple global variables right here, x and y. Then we are using that to assign a new value to y, which is y equal to x plus y. So this should be equal to 15. So we can add an echo statement right here. So echo variable y. So this should output 15. So I'm going to comment out this because we don't want to run the increment counter, but I'm going to run the function add numbers. So if we run this script, it's going to execute the add numbers function. So let's test it. So we're getting the answer as 15. So that's correct. So that's how we can define multiple global variables. We can also define global variables using the global superglobal. So let's have a look at an example of this. So I'm going to include a superglobal name equal to Paul. Then I'm going to include a function right here, greetings. So in this function, I'm going to echo a greeting, hello Paul. So I will echo hello. Then I want to access this global variable name. So to do so, I'm going to add a concatenating operator. Then I'm going to use the global superglobal. This is going to enable me have an access to the superglobals. So I want access to the superglobal name. Then we can close this with a semicolon. So if I run this, so I'm going to execute this function greetings down here, greetings. So let's run this. So as you can see, we are getting hello Paul, meaning we are able to access the global variable name using the global superglobal. So some of the best practices when using global variables is you need to limit the use of global variables. While global variables can be convenient, overusing them can lead to tight coupled code, making debugging and testing more challenging. Also prefer function parameters. Whenever possible, pass variables as function argument instead of relying on global variables. Then also use the global superglobal whenever it's absolutely necessary, because in most cases it can make your code less readable. So that's it for the global variables. So now let's have a look at the static variables. The static variables are declared using the static keyword inside a function. Unlike local variables, they retain their value even after the function execution ends. So some of the key points is that static variables are initialized only once, and their value persists across multiple calls to the function. Now let's take a look at static variables. Static variables are declared using static keyword inside a function. Unlike local variables, they retain their value even after the function execution ends. Some of the key points about static variables are they are initialized only once, and their value persists across multiple calls to the function. So now let's have a look at an example of how we declare static variables. So I'm going to have my function right here. So I'll have a function counter. Then inside the function counter, I'm going to declare a static variable counter, and we're going to give it a value of 0. Then we're going to auto increment the counter value. then we echo the value of the counter. So I'm going to add this escape sequence that is going to add a new line whenever we execute this function. So I'm going to add the escape sequence n that is going to create a new line whenever we run this function. So let's come down here and we are going to comment out the greetings and add number. Then I'm going to execute the counter function 3 times. Remember, the first time we execute the counter will be equal to 1. So the second time we execute the counter will be taking the value of a global variable y from the first counter function and passing it to the second counter function and the same to the next counter function, meaning we'll be retaining the value of y, unlike on local variable whereby we are not able to retain a value of a variable once the execution of that function stops. So I'll execute the counter function 3 times right here. So for this, we'll be able to retain the value of counter, because the first time we run this counter, the value will be equal to 1, because the initial value is 0. So if we run the increment, it will be 1, meaning if we run the counter again, since this is a static variable, it means that we will retain the value 1, and in the next counter function, it means that counter will be equal to 1 instead of 0, as opposed to local variable whereby the value is not retained. So let's save this and run. So as you can see, we have 1, 2, and 3, meaning we are retaining the value of counter and it's been passed to the next counter function. So the best practices for static variable is ideal for functions that needs to maintain state information. We've managed to go through the different variable scopes, that is global variable, local variable, and now the static variables. So understanding variable scopes in PHP is crucial for writing clean, efficient, and maintainable code. By using local, global, and static variables properly, you will ensure better organization and performance in your PHP applications. So see you into our next lecture. Thank you.